"You're not welcome at our family dinners anymore, Evelyn," my daughter-in-law said as she set a bowl of mashed potatoes in the center of the table, like she was discussing the weather instead of erasing me from my own family. The room went completely silent after that. Even the soft jazz music playing from the kitchen speaker suddenly felt too loud. I looked up slowly from my plate and stared at Vanessa across the dining table my late husband had built with his own hands almost 30 years ago. The warm chandelier light reflected against her gold bracelet as she crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair with that small smile she always wore whenever she thought she'd won something. Daniel sat beside her, my son, staring down at his glass of iced tea, like the answer might be floating somewhere near the melting ice cubes. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. And somehow, that hurt more than her words. I glanced toward the empty chair at the end of the table. Richard's chair. My husband's chair. Except it wasn't his anymore. Vanessa had placed her designer handbag there tonight like she belonged in his place now. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the dining room, but suddenly I couldn't taste anything. 3 months ago, this house still sounded like laughter. Richard humming while carving turkey, football games playing too loud in the living room, Daniel complaining about my sweet tea being too sugary. Now the walls felt cold even with the heat running. "I just think it's time we started having boundaries," Vanessa continued, smoothing the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater. "Daniel and I are trying to build our own family traditions." Family traditions. I almost smiled at the irony. We were sitting inside the very house I spent 32 years paying for. I remembered clipping coupons at midnight while Richard worked double shifts at the machine plant. I remembered repainting these cabinets myself one summer because we couldn't afford contractors. Every inch of this home carried fingerprints from my life, and now I was being treated like an unwanted guest inside it. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder than it needs to be. I repeated those words quietly in my mind while Vanessa reached over and squeezed his hand like she'd trained him for this conversation. Outside the dining room windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. The backyard lights reflected across the wet patio where Richard and I used to drink coffee every Sunday morning. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table and stood up without saying a word. Vanessa watched me closely, probably expecting tears, maybe even an argument. But I simply smiled. A small one. Calm. Controlled. Because in that exact moment, something inside me became very, very quiet. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always did after Richard passed away. For a few seconds, lying there beneath the pale gray light creeping through the curtains, I forgot he was gone. My hand moved automatically across the bed searching for warmth that no longer existed. The empty space beside me felt colder than usual. Downstairs, the house was quiet except for the low humming sound of the refrigerator and the rain still dripping from the gutters outside. I wrapped my cream cardigan tighter around myself and started the coffee maker, listening to the familiar clicking sounds echo through the kitchen. This used to be my favorite room in the house. Richard always said the kitchen was the heart of a family. Lately, it felt more like a waiting room. I opened the cabinet for my favorite coffee mug and paused. It was gone. In its place sat a row of matching white ceramic mugs Vanessa had bought last month. Everything in this house was slowly starting to look like her. Her scented candles, her cookbooks, her framed vacation photos. Even the hand towels had changed. I stood there for a long moment holding the cabinet door open while the coffee brewed behind me. Then I noticed something else. My family photo with Daniel at his college graduation was missing from the counter near the sink. I looked around the kitchen carefully until I finally spotted it sitting face down beside a stack of unopened mail near the pantry. Face down, like someone had accidentally knocked it over and never bothered fixing it. Or maybe not accidentally at all. I picked up the frame slowly and wiped away a thin layer of dust with my thumb. Daniel looked so young in that picture. 22 years old. Proud. Smiling beside me in his blue graduation gown while Richard stood behind us with his arm around my shoulders. Back then, Daniel still called me every Sunday just to talk. Back then, family dinners did not feel like negotiations. Upstairs, I heard footsteps moving across the hallway floor. Vanessa was awake. A moment later, She entered the kitchen already dressed in expensive workout clothes, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail. She stopped when she saw me holding the photo. For half a second, something uncomfortable flickered across her face before the smile returned. "Oh," she said casually, opening the refrigerator. "I was reorganizing last night. I must have forgotten to put that back." Reorganizing. That was the word she used for everything now. Reorganizing closets. Reorganizing cabinets. Reorganizing family space. I watched her pour almond milk into a glass without looking at me once. "Daniel and I were thinking about turning your sewing room into a nursery someday," she added lightly. "It gets the best morning light." My fingers tightened around the picture frame. Sewing room. She meant my room. The one where I still kept Richard's old flannel jackets folded neatly in cedar chests because I could not bear to donate them yet. Vanessa finally glanced over at me and smiled again.
Calm.
Polite. Careful. Like someone speaking to a neighbor instead of the woman who owned the house she was standing in. And right then, standing barefoot on my own kitchen floor with cold coffee growing stale beside me, I realized something painful. They were no longer waiting for me to leave. In their minds, I already had. 3 days later, the house smelled like fresh paint and lemon cleaner when I came back from grocery shopping. For a moment, standing in the front hallway with 2 paper bags balanced against my hip, I thought I had walked into the wrong house. The framed landscape painting Richard bought during our anniversary trip to Vermont was gone. From the wall above the staircase, in its place hung a large abstract canvas filled with harsh black lines and gold circles that looked cold and expensive. I stood there quietly while the front door clicked shut behind me. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving furniture. Drawers opening. Closet doors slamming softly. Rearranging again. I carried the groceries into the kitchen and stopped short when I saw several glossy magazines spread across the island counter. Home renovation catalogs. Luxury interiors. Modern family living spaces. One page had been folded carefully at the corner. I do not know why I opened it. Maybe some part of me already knew I would find something painful there. Across the page was a photo of a fully remodeled master bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows and cream-colored walls. Someone had circled the image in red ink. Beside it, in Vanessa's handwriting, were the words, "Perfect after Evelyn relocates." Relocates. Not moves. Not downsizes. Relocates. Like I was office furniture. I slowly lowered myself into one of the kitchen chairs because suddenly my knees felt weak. The clock above the stove ticked steadily while afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors Richard spent an entire summer installing himself. I remembered handing him nails one by one while country music played from an old radio in the garage. We were younger then, tired all the time, but happy. Every paycheck went into this house. Every birthday. Every overtime shift. Every sacrifice. Upstairs, footsteps approached the staircase. I closed the magazine just as Vanessa entered the kitchen, carrying a decorative storage box against her chest. She froze briefly when she noticed the catalogs on the counter. Then her expression smoothed over again into that practiced calmness she wore like makeup. "Oh, good," she said lightly. "You saw those. I have been collecting ideas for future renovations." Future renovations. The words hung between us. I looked at the storage box in her arms and immediately recognized it. It had belonged to Richard. He used to keep old fishing photographs and handwritten Christmas cards inside it. "Where did you get that?" I asked. Quietly, Vanessa glanced down. "This old thing?" she replied with a shrug. "It was taking up space in the hallway closet. I figured we should start sorting through unnecessary items eventually." Unnecessary items. My husband reduced to clutter. I stared at her for a long moment while late afternoon light poured through the kitchen windows behind her, turning the edges of her blonde hair almost white. She looked young, comfortable, certain this house already belonged to her. Then she smiled slightly and added, "You know, once Daniel and I have children, we are really going to need more room around here." Around here. Not your house. Not Evelyn's home. Around here. That was when something cold settled quietly into my chest. Not anger. Not grief. Something calmer than both. because for the first time, I realized Vanessa was not hiding her plans anymore. She genuinely believed I was powerless. That night, I could not sleep. Rain drifted softly against the bedroom windows while shadows from the maple tree outside moved slowly across the ceiling. Richard used to love storms. He always said rain made a house feel alive. I lay there listening to the empty side of the bed beside me and realized this was the first time since his funeral that I truly felt alone. Not lonely, alone. Around midnight, I finally got up and walked barefoot down the hallway toward Richard's old study. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Vanessa rarely came in here because the room still looked exactly the way he left it. Dark oak bookshelves, leather chair near the lamp, his reading glasses folded neatly beside an unfinished crossword puzzle on the desk. Even now, the room still carried traces of a cedarwood cologne mixed with old paper and coffee. I switched on the small desk lamp and sat quietly in his chair for several minutes, staring at the framed photograph beside the computer monitor. Richard and I stood on the front porch the day we bought this house in 1994. I was 32. He was 35. We looked exhausted and proud at the same time. The siding still needed repainting back then. The roof leaked during heavy rain. We could barely afford the down payment, and for the first 2 years we slept on a mattress placed directly on the floor because every extra dollar went toward repairs. But Richard loved this house from the beginning. One day, he told me while we painted the nursery for Daniel, "This place will protect our family long after we are gone." I remember laughing because he sounded so serious about it. Richard was always planning ahead. Insurance policies, savings accounts, emergency envelopes hidden inside kitchen drawers. He trusted people, but he trusted paperwork more. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found exactly what I expected to find. File folders stacked with neat handwritten labels. Taxes, utilities, mortgage documents, property insurance. Everything perfectly organized the way Richard always kept it. My fingers paused on a thick cream-colored folder labeled House Trust. For a moment, I simply stared at it while thunder rolled faintly somewhere in the distance. Then I opened it slowly. The paperwork inside smelled faintly of dust and ink. Legal documents, signatures, dates. Richard's careful handwriting in the margins. I adjusted my reading glasses and continued turning pages until one sentence made my heart stop completely. Sole ownership retained by surviving spouse under irrevocable family trust protection. I read the line 3 times. Then once more. My breathing slowed. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows while the old grandfather clock downstairs chimed 1 in the morning. Daniel's name appeared nowhere on the ownership transfer documents. Neither did Vanessa's. The house legally belonged to me. Entirely. Completely. Protected inside a trust Richard established years before his death. Suddenly, memories started returning all at once. Richard insisting we visit his attorney every few years. Richard telling me not to worry about future complications. Richard quietly saying one evening after dinner, "I know our son has a good heart, Evelyn, but people change when comfort becomes entitlement." At the time, I thought he was worrying too much. Now, sitting alone in the warm glow of his desk lamp with legal papers spread across my lap, I realized my husband had seen this storm coming long before I ever did. The following Sunday, Vanessa decided to host what she called a small family brunch. By 11 in the morning, the house smelled like cinnamon rolls and fresh bacon while sunlight poured through the dining room windows in soft golden stripes. I stood quietly in the hallway for a moment listening to laughter drift from the kitchen. Daniel's voice. Vanessa's bright, polished laugh. A few neighbors from down the street. Someone uncorking champagne. It sounded warm, comfortable, like the kind of gathering Richard and I used to host every holiday for almost 3 decades. Except this time, nobody had told me brunch was happening. I only realized guests were arriving when I heard the front doorbell ring 3 separate times while folding laundry upstairs. I looked down at myself. Faded blue cardigan, house slippers, reading glasses hanging from my neck. Not exactly the outfit of someone invited to a celebration inside her own home. For a second, I considered staying upstairs. But then I remembered something Richard once told me after an uncomfortable business dinner years ago. Never disappear quietly from a room people are trying to erase you from. So I straightened my shoulders and walked downstairs. The conversation in the kitchen softened almost immediately when I entered. Vanessa stood near the marble island pouring orange juice into crystal glasses while two women from her yoga class admired the renovated pantry shelves she had installed last month without asking me. Daniel looked up from the dining table and blinked with obvious surprise. "Oh," he said awkwardly. "Mom, you are awake." Awake. It was nearly noon. Vanessa recovered first. She smiled brightly, but her eyes tightened just slightly around the corners. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, "we did not want to disturb you. You looked tired lately." One of the women glanced between us uncomfortably before sipping her drink. I noticed there were place settings for 6 people at the table. Only 6. Everyone had matching cloth napkins folded neatly beside their plates. Everyone except me. My usual seat near the window now held a decorative flower arrangement with white roses and eucalyptus branches spilling across the center runner. I stared at it for a long second. Richard always sat across from me at that spot during every family meal. Vanessa followed my gaze and gave a tiny shrug. "I figured flowers opened up the space better," she explained casually. Opened up the space. Behind her, I noticed framed family photographs arranged neatly along the counter for guests to see. Vanessa and Daniel skiing in Colorado. Vanessa beside the Christmas tree. Vanessa holding their golden retriever at the lake. I was missing from every single frame. Not hidden. Removed. Carefully. Deliberately. Daniel shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe grab something light today. Vanessa made reservations for us later." Us. I looked around the bright kitchen filled with sunlight and polite smiles and realized something almost funny. They were no longer embarrassed by what they were doing. They genuinely believed I would simply adjust myself smaller and smaller until eventually there would be nothing left of me at all. Vanessa walked over then and gently touched my arm like she was comforting an elderly stranger. "You know," she said softly, "at this stage in life, peace and simplicity are probably best for everyone." I looked down at her hand resting on my sleeve. Then I slowly smiled. Because for the first time since Richard died, I finally understood exactly what kind of game they had been playing. The next Tuesday morning, I drove downtown for the first time in weeks. The sky hung low and gray above the city, while cold wind rattled the bare tree branches lining Main Street. I parked outside the same law office Richard and I had visited for nearly 20 years and sat inside my car for a full minute with both hands resting on the steering wheel. My reflection in the windshield looked older lately. Not weaker. Just awake in a way I had not been before. Inside, the office smelled like coffee and polished wood. Soft instrumental music drifted quietly through the reception area while rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking downtown traffic. "Mrs. Harper," the receptionist said warmly, "Mr. Calloway is ready for you." Harold Calloway looked almost exactly the same as he had during Richard's funeral. Silver hair, navy suit, calm eyes that missed very little. He stood when I entered his office and shook my hand carefully before motioning toward the chair across from his desk. "How are you holding up, Evelyn?" he asked softly. For a second, I almost answered automatically. "Fine. Managing. Taking it day by day." But instead, I looked down at the leather folder resting in my lap and quietly said, "I think my family has been waiting for me to disappear." Harold did not look surprised. That hurt more than if he had. He folded his hands slowly on the desk and sighed. "Richard worried something like this might happen eventually," he admitted. I stared at him. "He knew?" Harold nodded once. "Not specifically. But he believed comfort can change people, especially when large assets are involved." Large assets. Such a cold phrase for a home filled with 30 years of birthdays and Christmas mornings. Harold opened a thick file and turned several pages toward me. Property records. Trust agreements. Legal protections. Every signature perfectly organized. Richard really had prepared for everything. "The house belongs entirely to you," Harold explained calmly. Daniel has no ownership rights unless you choose to transfer them. I looked down at the paperwork while my heartbeat slowed into something strangely steady. Outside the office window, people hurried along sidewalks carrying umbrellas against the rain. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed faintly through traffic. Life moving forward like always. And if I decided to sell? I asked quietly. Harold adjusted his glasses. Then the decision is solely yours. The room went silent after that. I stared at the rain sliding slowly down the window glass and suddenly remembered Vanessa standing in my kitchen discussing nursery plans like my future had already been settled for me. I remembered the flower arrangement replacing my seat at the brunch table, the photographs without me, the careful little humiliations disguised as practicality. Harold cleared his throat gently. Evelyn, may I ask something honestly? I nodded. Do you still want to live there? The question hit harder than I expected, because for months, I had been so focused on surviving inside that house that I had forgotten to ask myself whether it still felt like home. I sat quietly for several seconds before finally answering.
No, y vull esperar.
I think they already buried the version of me that belonged there. Harold studied me carefully. Then he slid a business card across the desk. A realtor, one of the best in the county. I picked it up slowly between my fingers while thunder rolled softly outside. And for the first time since Richard died, I felt something dangerous beginning to return. Control. By Friday afternoon, the house felt strangely lighter to me. Not happier, just clearer somehow. Like fog finally lifting from a road you have been driving blind for months. Vanessa spent most of the morning upstairs talking loudly on speakerphone with someone about backsplash samples and nursery themes while I sat quietly in the sunroom beside the backyard garden filling out paperwork Harold had printed for me. Realtor agreements, market estimates, listing authorization forms. My hands remained perfectly steady as I signed each page. Outside, weak winter sunlight stretched across the lawn where Daniel used to play baseball with Richard every summer after dinner. I could still hear their laughter if I closed my eyes long enough. Around 4 o'clock, Vanessa came downstairs carrying shopping bags from an expensive home decor store downtown. She stopped short when she noticed several folders spread across the coffee table beside me. "What is all this?" she asked casually, though I noticed her smile tighten slightly. I looked up from the paperwork. "Just organizing finances," I answered calmly. That seemed to relax her immediately. She set the shopping bags down and began pulling out decorative fabric samples in soft neutral colors. "I found these for the upstairs remodel," she said brightly. "I am thinking warmer tones would make the house feel younger." Younger. Everything with Vanessa was about replacing age with something shinier. Faster. Easier to photograph. She draped fabric swatches across the sofa while talking about accent, walls, and future renovations like she was already starring in one of those home makeover shows she watched every night. Then Daniel came home. He loosened his tie while walking through the front door and barely glanced at me before kissing Vanessa on the cheek. That used to bother me. The way his attention drifted around me now like I was part of the furniture. But lately, I had stopped needing his approval to breathe. "Guess what?" Vanessa said excitedly. "I booked us a consultation with a contractor next week." Daniel smiled tiredly. "That is great, babe." Then his eyes finally landed on the folders near me. "What contractor?" he asked distractedly. Vanessa laughed softly. "For the renovation, obviously. I told you I want to open up the downstairs once we eventually transition the house fully." Transition the house fully. I watched Daniel carefully. He did not question the phrase, did not hesitate. He simply nodded while loosening his cufflinks. That was when I understood something painful and final. My son was no longer confused. He knew exactly what Vanessa wanted. And somewhere along the way, he had decided her version of the future mattered more than mine. Vanessa sat beside him on the sofa and flipped through her fabric samples while speaking casually about converting my sewing room into a nursery and replacing Richard's study with a home gym. A home gym. The room where my husband spent his final weeks reading history books and drinking black coffee before sunrise. I folded my hands quietly in my lap and listened to them redesign my life around me, like I was already gone. Then Vanessa looked over and smiled politely. Of course, she added sweetly. We would help you find a nice condo nearby when the time comes.
Nearby.
Like I should feel grateful for relocation assistance from people living inside my own home. The room went very still after that. Soft evening light filtered through the curtains while the grandfather clock ticked steadily near the staircase. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, but still said nothing. Not one word. And suddenly, I felt completely calm. Because, at that exact moment, sitting there while they planned my replacement right in front of me, I finally made my decision. The realtor arrived the following Monday at exactly 10:15 in the morning while Vanessa was out getting coffee with friends from her yoga studio. Cold sunlight spilled across the front porch as a silver SUV pulled into the driveway behind my car. I stood at the living room window watching a young couple step out beside a woman in a navy wool coat carrying a leather folder against her chest. For a strange moment, my heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Not because I doubted my decision, because suddenly it was real. Margaret Ellis, the realtor Harold recommended, greeted me with a warm handshake and calm professional eyes that reminded me slightly of Richard. Beautiful property, she said softly while stepping into the foyer. The market is going to move fast on this one. Property. Another cold word for the place where my son took his first steps and where Richard kissed me in the kitchen every Christmas morning before guests arrived. Margaret walked carefully through each room making notes, while the young couple followed behind her admiring the hardwood floors and oversized windows. They loved the sunroom immediately. Richard would have smiled hearing that. Around 11 o'clock, the front door suddenly opened. Vanessa entered carrying 2 coffee cups and laughing into her phone. Then she stopped.
Completely.
Her smile vanished the second she saw strangers standing in the dining room. I will call you back, she said quickly before lowering the phone. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. Margaret stepped forward politely. Good morning, she said warmly. We're just doing an initial walkthrough today. Vanessa blinked twice. Walkthrough? Her eyes moved toward me sharply. I remained seated calmly near the fireplace with my hands folded in my lap. The young couple exchanged an awkward glance beside the staircase while Margaret continued professionally discussing square footage and recent market values like this was any ordinary home showing. Vanessa slowly set her coffee cups down on the kitchen counter without taking her eyes off me. Evelyn, she said carefully, what exactly is going on? I looked up at her quietly. I am selling the house. The color drained from her face so fast it almost frightened me. You cannot be serious. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Margaret pretended not to notice and continued writing notes on her clipboard. Vanessa stared at me like she had suddenly realized she never actually knew who I was at all. Daniel lives here, she whispered sharply. We live here. I nodded once. For now. The room went completely silent after that. Outside, wind rattled the bare tree branches while sunlight flickered across the hardwood floors Richard installed with his own hands almost 30 years earlier. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. You are trying to punish us. I almost laughed at that.
Punish them.
As though boundaries and consequences were cruelty instead of reality. I looked toward the young couple admiring the backyard through the sunroom windows and suddenly imagined another family filling these rooms someday. A family that might actually appreciate the home instead of treating it like an inheritance waiting room. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly against her chest. Daniel is going to lose his mind when he finds out. Her confidence was gone now. In its place sat something much uglier.
Panic.
And for the first time since Richard died, I did not feel invisible anymore. The house officially sold 3 weeks later on a quiet Thursday afternoon. By then, most of my personal things had already been moved into a small condo across town overlooking a little lake surrounded by maple trees. It was not large. No grand staircase. No oversized dining room. But when I unlocked the front door for the first time and stepped inside, the silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. The final morning at the old house arrived cold and bright. Pale winter sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors while movers carried the last sealed boxes through the front door. I stood alone in the kitchen for a moment holding my car keys tightly in one hand and looking around at the room where I had spent half my life cooking Sunday dinners and birthday cakes. The walls looked strangely bare, without family photographs, without Richard's old coffee mugs beside the sink, without me. Upstairs, I could hear drawers opening and slamming rapidly. Vanessa had spent the entire morning panicking from room to room while Daniel argued quietly with someone on the phone about temporary housing. They had not believed me at first, even after the contracts were signed, even after the inspection. Some part of them truly thought I would change my mind at the last minute simply because they finally looked afraid. Around noon, Daniel walked slowly into the kitchen. He looked exhausted now, older somehow, his dress shirt wrinkled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he finally looked at me and asked quietly, "How could you do this to us?" The question almost broke my heart, not because I felt guilty but because he still did not understand. I set my keys gently on the counter and looked at my son carefully. "Daniel," I said softly, "you stopped being my family long before I sold this house." He stared at me in silence while the refrigerator hummed quietly behind us. Somewhere outside, movers rolled another cart across the driveway. "We were just trying to build a future," he muttered weakly. I nodded slowly. "And you decided there was no place for me in it." He lowered his eyes after that because deep down, he knew it was true. Vanessa never came downstairs to say goodbye. I think pride would not let her. Or maybe fear. Before leaving, I walked one final time through Richard's old study. The room stood empty now except for soft afternoon sunlight stretching across the floorboards. I closed my eyes briefly and could almost hear his voice again.
Calm, steady, prepared.
He had protected me even after death because he understood something I had spent years ignoring. Love without respect eventually turns into entitlement. A few minutes later, I stepped outside carrying my overnight bag while cold wind moved through the trees above the driveway. I did not cry. I did not look back dramatically. I simply locked the front door for the last time and handed the keys to the realtor. As I drove away, sunlight reflected softly across the windshield while the old house disappeared smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. And strangely, I felt lighter than I had in years. Maybe some of you listening know exactly what that kind of betrayal feels like. Maybe you have also been made to feel invisible inside your own family. If you have ever had someone mistake your kindness for weakness, or your silence for surrender, I would truly like to hear your story. Tell me honestly, what would you have done in my place?